हेलो एवरीवन, वेलकम टू सिविल फ्रंट। दोस्तों, सिविल फ्रंट में आपका बहुत बहुत स्वागत है। दोस्तों, डेली मेंस आंसर राइटिंग प्रोग्राम थ्रू प्रीवियस ईयर क्वेश्चन का आज हमारा है डे 5। डे 5 के अंदर हम जनरल स्टडीज़ पेपर 1 का मॉडर्न हिस्ट्री जो है, मॉडर्न हिस्ट्री से रिलेटेड कुछ इंपॉर्टेंट प्रीवियस ईयर क्वेश्चंस हम आज करने की कोशिश करेंगे। दोस्तों, पहला क्वेश्चन है एक्सप्लेन हाउ अपराइजिंग ऑफ 1857 कॉन्स्टिट्यूट्स एन इम्पॉर्टेंट वाटरशेड in the evolution of the British policies towards the colonial India. जो colonial India है, colonial India. Okay. Now the important thing is we have to first break down the question. So before we break down the question, first read the question carefully. Try to understand what is the topic of the question, what is the context of the question. See, every question has three parts. Every question has three parts. One is directive. Second is topic, okay, and third is context. Every question, no matter what question it is, every question have such three parts. The directive shows the direction of the content, in which direction the content must flow. The topic is the main theme on which we have to write the content, and context is something, context shows us what are the boundaries. See, topic is something which tells us what to write. Topic is something which tells us what to write, correct? For example, here uprising of 1857 is our topic, so we have to write about uprising of 1857. But then what is the context? We have to see, to write about 1857 there are several number of things, there are thousands of things we can write about uprising of 1857. But then what are the, there must be some boundaries, there must be some limitations to what extent we should go into the depth of the uprisings of 1857. That is the most important thing, correct? Because if we are asked to write about uprising of 1857, we can even write 10 pages, 20 pages. But then in what context we have to write about uprising of 1857? There comes the context. The context is very important. Context tell us what are the boundaries, what are the limitations, what is the length and breadth of the topic we have to discuss. We have to discuss the topic, that is for sure. But then what should be the length and breadth, what are the boundaries, what should be the boundaries, okay, that is understood through the context. So context is something which defines the boundaries of the content, the topic. This is the topic, and this context defines the boundaries. But then there are some directives also. Directives, for example, explain is a directive. So this directive tells us that what should be the direction. See, one thing is topic, second thing is their boundaries, and third thing is their direction. In what direction the content must flow, in what direction the topic must go, that is told by the that is understood through the directive. So here explain is the directive, uprising of the 1857 is the topic, and as a watershed in the evolution of the British policies toward colonial India is the context. We have to write uprising of 1857, not just simply what was it and how it contributed, who participated, etc. Not all these things. We have to write in context of how it proved to be an watershed event in the evolution of the British policies towards the colonial India. So we have to write in this context, correct? So because in the introduction we will, because it's our topic, the topic is uprising of 1857. So in the introduction we will write about this event, that what was revolt of 1857 and what was its broad significance, correct? Its broad significance we will write. So then what were the impacts of the uprising of 1857 on the British colonial policies? Basically we have to write the impact, because how it proved to be a watershed in the evolution of the overall British policy. The British policies right after the 1857, the policies of British India or British government started evolving in a different direction, be it religious policies, be it their military policy, even be it their policy towards the princely king, or be it their policies towards the peasants or farmers or anything, correct? So overall their policies got shifted, they got evolved, correct. So how they evolved right after the 1857, how these policies got evolved, that entire thing we have to document in this particular answer. Fine. Now the first and foremost important thing after the revolt of 1857 which happened is the end of the company rule. Company rule, India was under the company rule, Indian colony was under the company rule, and it got established the crown rule. Fine. This uprising of 1857 that actually led to the dissolution of East India Company. If you remember, East India Company came to India to do trade, correct, to do business, to do trade and commerce, eventually created their political administration, political empire, kind of political establishment they have started doing instead of trade. So that is what East India Company. But then under the Government of India Act 1858, under the Government of India Act 1858, this East India Company got dissolved. Okay, I hope you understand. The Government of India Act 1858, very significant thing, dissolved the East India Company. So now the British Crown, the imperial rule right from the London, the imperial rule, the British Crown assumed the direct control of India. Earlier it was controlled, India was earlier controlled through the East India Company. Now East India Company got dissolved, and now under the 1858 Act, British Crown now assumed the India and direct control of the India. And now the Secretary of State for India, there was a Secretary of State appointed dedicatedly for India, who was appointed in the London to oversee the governance of the country. So basically Queen's Proclamation of 1858 that assured non-interference in the religious and social practices, because somewhere this was one of the prominent reason for the revolt of 1857, that the interference of the British got increased, and that actually hurt the sentiments of the people, religious sentiment and social sentiment. So somehow Queen's Proclamation of 1857 assured that there will be no interference, correct. Now, so the governance got shift from the profit driven corporate rule which was East India Company earlier, that is now under the centralized imperial administration which was British Crown. The second most significant development was reorganization of army. This was a very important aspect. The mutiny, the revolt of 1857, that revealed the flaws in the military structure, of the British, particularly their over reliance on the Indian soldiers. The military had a good amount of Indian soldiers, composition, and because many of the soldiers also rebelled, so that led the British to rethink upon their military or basically their army policy and composition. After revolt of 1857, British significantly reduced the proportion of Indian soldiers because they wanted to reduce the reliance, their dependence upon the Indian soldiers in the army, and they emphasized recruiting from the so-called martial races, because now who composed the martial races? Sikhs, Gurkhas and Pathans. They were pursued to be very loyal to the British government, and that's why now Britishers want to recruit more people from the martial race in their Indian army, in their basically British army. Okay, so the ratio of the British to Indian troops was increased, and artillery, correct, was kept exclusively under the British control, so that they can prevent another kind of large scale rebellion. The third policy shift is the policy of divide and rule. To prevent the unity among the different communities. There are different communities in India, there were different communities in the British India, and if they united different communities together, can really challenge the British administration and the rule, and that's why that was in the interest of the British to prevent that unity to occur. They wanted to divide them, they wanted to keep them divided. So that's why British adopted a systematic policy of divide and rule, a systematic policy of divide and rule. They actually encourage the divisions of the, they actually increase the division between Hindus and Muslims. Hindus and Muslims, they want to increase, they want to encourage such division so that they should not get united, correct? So but this particular policy of divide and rule have actually sowed seeds of the communal discord which we still witnessed in India and also in the South Asia. So for instance, they supported Muslim landlords and elites as a counterbalance to the largely Hindu middle class intelligentsia. The next important policy shift is the greater involvement to the Indian princess, learning from the support many princely states. Actually during the revolt of 1857, many princely states, they were actually in the side of British, they supported British, correct? And because of that, because princely states were in favor or in support of British during the rebellion, the British government, colonial government, they adopted a policy of non-interference in the internal affairs of the princely states, correct? They adopted a policy of non-interference in the internal affairs of the princely states. The doctrine of lapse, which was used earlier, correct, that was a major grievance of the princely states. So that was abandoned. Colonial government abandoned this because they were happy with the princely states supporting them during the rebellion. So that's why they now decided that they won't interfere in the internal affairs of the princely states. The next big change in the policy is economic exploitation continued but with some caution. Economic exploitation continued but with some caution. This is very important. See, while economic policies continued to favor British interest, obviously economic policies of British will only favor the British interest, but the rebellion made the British more cautious right now about directly alienating the peasantry and the landed class. If they directly alienate the peasantry and the landed class, they have already seen the consequences of it in the form of 1857 rebellion. So what they did is they continued with the zamindari system, and that was retained and strengthened. In fact, that was strengthened, ensuring the landlord loyalty, so that if the zamindari system is retained and strengthened, the landlords, the zamindars, would remain loyal. And to ensure this loyalty, they actually strengthen and retain the zamindari system. But again, the same thing continued. The exploitation of the peasants, that was continued. So this policy more or less continued with some basic changes. About education and intellectual policy, what was the shift? British began using Western education more strategically to create a class of the Indians loyal to the British rule. They wanted to see, Britishers were not aimed, or their objective was not to educate the masses. Their objective was to educate few people, just so that they got resources for the administration. Now there too, they provided education which was Western. So they wanted to create Indians, they wanted to create such Indians who were Western in their outlooks, So they were careful of not educate the masses broadly. They don't wanted to educate the masses. Why? Because they wanted to avoid any kind of revolution to foster, or any kind of revolutionary idea to foster in the minds, because education is a very revolutionary weapon. If people got educated, if masses got educated, the revolutionary ideas will come into their mind, and that will actually oppose the British administration. So they don't want it. So that's why they wanted to only educate few people, that too through the Western education, so that they got a human resource to actually run their administration. and the people who are educated, they must be educated in the western language, they must be educated, they must be given western education, so that the people are Indian but western in their outlook. They also reassess their administrative practices, they also actually reassess their administrative policies, and they adopted a more decentralized approach to the governance, because see, the local administrators were given greater autonomy to ensure they could act swiftly to quell potential uprising if there is. See, now they actually adopted a more decentralized approach. That doesn't mean that they wanted to decentralize the power, they wanted to devolve the power, they wanted to strengthen the democracy at the grassroots level. No, this was not their motive. Their main motive was, if there is any uprising at the local level, that must be understood. If there is any potential uprising, that must be understood earlier and very swiftly. There must be action against it, so that no rebellion can grow at the large scale, which was of the revolt of 1857. Also about social reforms, if we see, the rebellion caused the British to become cautious. Now earlier they used to take so many social reforms, but then now British has become very cautious about the introduction of the social reforms, correct? Because see, while reforms such as abolition of sati and promotion of widow remarriage had been introduced even earlier, correct? But then British avoided pushing contentious issues like caste abolition or conversion campaigns, which they feared might provoke further kind of unrest, correct? Because that hurt the religious sentiments, social sentiments, and they don't want to hurt the social sentiments again, so that there is any repercussion and threat and vulnerability to the British Empire. So if we see the significance of the uprising as a watershed movement, that is the recognition of the Indian sentiments, that is the first important thing. Emergence of national consciousness, that is the second important significance, correct? And one is foundation for the modern colonial administration, fine. So then we can conclude, because as it is a watershed moment, we can conclude by stating that it has actually inspired the upcoming movements. By saying this we can conclude, fine. And we can say so many important things, like British administration started taking things seriously, but this was also one of the development, so we can say this. But moving to the second question, since the decade of 1920s, the national movement acquired various ideological strands and thereby expanded its social base. So we have to first identify what were the various ideological strands. Let's say socialism, let's say Marxism, let's say communalism, let's say basically Gandhian strategies, correct? So these were the various different ideological strands. And then the national movement after 1920s, we don't have to write before 1920s. After 1920s, what were the various ideological strands that actually helped expand the base of the social base, actually the social base of the national movement, correct? Now what is mean by social base? Social base means, if the people from the different strata of the society, let's say women, let's say labor class, let's say peasant, let's say workers, correct? Let's say zamindars, and let's say any other sections of the society, if they come together in the national movement, obviously that will help in broadening the social base of the national movement. More broad the social base of the national movement, more diverse the base of the national movement, more united and stronger the national movement will be, and that was the ultimate goal, correct? And that's why the leaders always tried to incorporate the various different ideological or various different sections of the society. The first and foremost important ideological strand we have to see is Gandhian ideology. See, Mahatma Gandhi's leadership after 1919 brought non-violence and satyagraham in the national movement. So he actually emphasized the non-violent resistance resonated across all sections of the society. Now the movements like non-cooperation movement, civil disobedience movement, they mobilized peasants, students, women and urban elites, transforming this struggle into a mass movement. See, any struggle can only be converted into a mass movement when the larger and larger sections of the society come together and masses got mobilized. Then only it will be known as a mass movement. So Gandhi's promotion of Swadeshi and Khadi, that symbolized the economic self-reliance and that linked with the nationalism and economic empowerment. Fine. Now the next ideological stand was revolutionary nationalism. There were bunch of young people actually, they were not satisfied with the non-violence techniques, and that's why that gave a rise to the revolutionary organizations like Hindustan Socialist Republican Association, that led by the Bhagat Singh, Chandrasekhar Azad and others. So revolutionary activities such as Kakuri conspiracy and Lahore conspiracy, these conspiracies and these revolutionary activities actually inspired youth and drew their attention to the urgency of India's independence struggle. People felt that it's very important and urgent to make India independent. Next ideological stand, if we see, growth of socialist and communist ideologies. Inspired by the Russian Revolution, there was a Russian Revolution 1917 that actually inspired the socialist and communist ideologies, which influenced the leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru, Subhash Chandra Bose, M.N. Roy, correct, and that also inspired to form a Communist Party of India in 1925, which actually introduced the ideas of workers' rights, anti-imperialism and economic equality. So such ideas were introduced through the Communist Party of India, and that actually gained attraction among the industrial workers and peasants. So now the section of a society belonging to industrial workers and peasants, they also got attracted towards the national movement, correct. Now emergence of Dalit, this is also very important voice, marginalized voice. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, he emerged as a prominent leader of the Dalits, and he criticizes the Congress inability to address the caste discrimination. According to him, Congress had not successfully eliminated or addressed the problem of caste discrimination, and that's why he formed Bahishkrit Hitakarini Sabha in 1924. And he advocated for the rights of the depressed classes, and that introduced a new dimension to the movement. Now the national movement become even more broader because of the involvement of the depressed classes. A part of that, the peasant and worker movements were also there. They also got, for example, All India Trade Union Congress and Kisan Sabhas. They highlighted the issues like land reforms, very important, fair wages, correct, and better working conditions in the industries or companies. So that actually helped expand the movement's reach to the rural and industrial areas. Now the people working in the industries, their concerns were related to fair wages, their concerns were related to better working conditions. They also brought into the movement, and through the All India Trade Union Congress, and also the farmers whose concerns were related to the land reforms, they were also brought into the national movement through the Kisan Sabhas, and even the movement become more and more prominent and broad-based. Inclusion of women, the participation of women, like prominent women like Sarojini Naidu, Kasturba Gandhi and Annie Besant, they also got involved. Then there were some communal and regional aspirations. A Muslim League under the leadership of M.A. Jinnah, then Akali movement in the Punjab. These represented specific cultural and religious concerns that has actually enriched the broader nationalist discourse. A part of that, there were some other elements like cultural and intellectual moments. Literature, music and art also played a really very crucial role in shaping the nationalist consciousness, the consciousness. For example, Rabindranath Tagore's writings and Subramaniam Bharati's poetry and Abhindranath Tagore's paintings, they emphasized the Indian identity and heritage. For example, Vande Mataram edited by Aurobindo Ghosh, that disseminated the nationalist ideas across the regions. Fine. So this is how different strands, different ideological strands got entered into the national movement, and the national movement becomes even more broader and become a mass movement in its true sense because of its diversity. It got reflected due to the introduction of the different strands into the national movement. Now if you see what is the ideological diversification, what is the impact of this ideological diversification, if we see in the national movement, there are a diverse groups of the people belonging to different sections of the society. So what was the impact? First, it has actually helped to make the movement a mass movement. So mass mobilization is one thing. It also helped create a pan-Indian identity. Now the goal of the freedom becomes even more broader because of the accommodation of various different strands, and it has also created a foundation for the post-independence policies. For example, what would be the labor policies, what should be the working conditions, what should be the provisions for the women's for the gender equality. All these things got into the picture, into the constitutional and into the constitutional picture, into the constitutional imagination, as well as into the policies of the government after India, that were actually inspired through these ideological strands, participated in the national movement, making it a broad base. If we see the next question, to what extent did the role of moderates prepare a base for a wider freedom movement? Now this is very important. Here the topic is moderate. Moderate section of the national movement. Okay, so what is the role of these moderates, and at what extent the role of moderates prepare a base for the wider freedom movement? See, a freedom movement become wider and even a broad based in the latter times, but before that there was a basic. When Gandhiji entered into the picture, so he already had a good mass base which was actually prepared by the moderates. So we have to actually write about it, that how these moderates created that broad base, basically a wider base for the freedom movement which were about to come. So we can first talk about moderates and their initial contribution, correct, and then we can talk about the role and contributions of the moderates. So first and foremost important thing is what they did is they provided an ideological foundation to the national movement. Now in terms of ideology, if we see what were the ideologies, one was nationalism. Second, if we see economic critique of the colonialism, so that is anti-colonialism. And third important aspect is the constitutional mean, faith in the constitutional mean. They had faith in the constitutional mean, so constitutionalism. So moderates actually worked upon these three ideological foundations, which were actually nationalism, anti-colonialism and constitutionalism, which actually helped to make the movement even broad based in the coming times. Nationalism was very important, anti-colonialism was also very important. Then second was creation of the political awareness. Moderates have because moderates were pioneer of the national movements, they had actually helped creating the political awareness in the masses or in the people of the India. For example, they started awakening masses. They were instrumental in educating Indians about their rights and the exploitative nature of the British rule through the drain of wealth through the drain of wealth policy, the moderates like Dadabhai Nauroji, they actually exposed the exploitative nature of the British rule, and also they educated Indians. They also educated Indians about their rights. Fine. Then institutional and organizational foundation. If we see institutional or organizational foundation, to lead any movement successfully, we need some organizational structure and also some institutional structure. So that institutional structure and some organizational structure in the form of Indian National Congress was actually provided by moderates, and this was even because in the latter times, if we see, Indian National Congress was the organization which was very active and prominent in the India struggle for independence. So basically the very foundation of Indian National Congress was done by the moderates. So that was their one of the important contribution. Founded in 1885, Indian National Congress became the principal organization leading India's struggle for independence. Even if we see development of some political techniques, because if you want to lead a movement, if you want to go through a movement, they introduce the techniques like how to draft a petition. You must know how to draft a petition, you must know how to hold public meetings, you must know how to lobby the British officials for your interest. So all these things helped further movement, the upcoming movements, with some political techniques, with some effective political techniques. If we see the economic reforms and public welfare, the advocacy of Indian interests, moderates actually emphasized. Moderates consistently used to demand for reducing the military expenditure. Moderates continued to demand such kind of things like you have to reduce, British government must reduce the military expenditure, because all the military expenditure, in the fact all the expenditure of the British government was at the expense of the taxes collected from the people of India, which were actually very poor, made by the British colonial policies itself. So this reducing military expenditure and equitable taxation and investment in infrastructure, all these were demands on which the moderates emphasized for the Indian interest. For example, if we see Gopal Krishna Gokhale, he demanded better irrigation systems, and he also demanded for the reduced land revenue taxes, so to alleviate the rural distress. Correct. Also support for education. They called for wider access to education. Moderates actually called for a wider access to the education, including technical and scientific, because if there is a wider reach of the education, according to moderate, that will improve the literacy rates, and that will actually help create even more conscious and revolutionary ideas and people. Promoting of unity and secularism. Moderates also tried to bridge the communal divides. They took efforts to bridge the communal divides. For example, moderates, they avoided religious polarization. It means they did not emphasize more upon the religious symbolism or anything which may hurt the sentiments of the other religious people. So that's why they actually worked for the Hindu-Muslim unity, or in fact the unity of the other religions. Correct. So they actually focused upon the secular kind of nationalism, secular idea of nationalism. Fine. But now here it is important for us to understand what were the limitations of the moderates. We have actually understood what were the contribution of the moderates. What was the role the moderates played? What was the role the moderates played to make the national movement a mass movement? But then their ideas, their strategies also had some limitations, and because of that they lack the mass mobilization. Because moderates, they were primarily represented the urban educated elite, failing to connect with the rural population. They could not connect with the rural population. They were educated elites. They belongs to urban areas. They were educated elites. They were educated from the foreign institutions. So they were well off people, and that's why they could not connect with the rural population or working class. So their reliance on petitions and loyalty to the crown also alienated them from the masses, because they mainly relied on the petitions, prayers, so that, and they felt that British government is actually good, and if we bring the problems into the picture, bring the problem in front of them, they will help us and solve us. That was their belief, and that's why they actually remain loyal to the crown, and they also rely on the petitions. Their progress was very slow. The progress was very slow because their policies were so much slow that believed upon the gradual improvement and gradual actually achievements. Fine. Also the failure, they also failed to address the communalism. They also failed to address the communalism. Fine. Now if we see what were the impact on the wider freedom movement, this is important. What were the impact? So the first impact is bridging the phase of the movement, bridging the phases of the movement. For example, moderates pursued inefficiency led to the rise of extremists, because they thought that because of the inefficiency only, that led to the rise of extremists like Gangadhar Tilak, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, who then adopted more radical methods. They adopted more radical methods. But then extremists built on the moderates' intellectual foundations itself. Correct. Also, the moderates provided an inspiration for the Gandhian era, for the non-violent approach, because Gandhian methods of satyagraha drew from the moderates' emphasis on the non-violence and dialogue, because moderates were mainly believed to have faith in the techniques of non-violence and dialogue that has actually inspired Gandhi to adopt the methods of satyagraha, which was a mass acclaim. And then institutional legacy, strengthening INC. Moderates laid the ground framework from the moderates laid groundwork for the Indian National Congress transformation into mass-based organization during the Gandhian phase. So then we can conclude, despite their limitation, their intellectual and organizational contributions bridged the gap between early nationalist aspirations and the mass movements that eventually secured India's independence. Correct. So this is how we can conclude. So this is all for now. We'll discuss few more questions in the next session. Thank you very much.